In this video, we'll learn why organizations fall and the equilibrium state of organizational communication network. First, what is an organization? An organization is a group of people work collectively to achieve a common goal. The common goal should drive all decisions made in the organization. Decisions in the organizations can be made by an organizational member at an individual level, such as a department head or a project manager. Decisions can also be made by a group of people, such as a board, a committee, a panel, a department, or a task force. In previous videos on social network analysis, we've covered the construct of emergence repeatedly. Emergence means the collective behavior of a network is more than the sum of its parts. In organizational context, organizational behavior is more than the sum of individual behavior. You can hire very talented people, but your organization as a whole may behave in a way that is far from collective wisdom. We've already covered the topics of the wisdom of crowds and the madness of crowds. But in organizations, there are some unique factors that influence how individuals and organizations make decisions. In this video, I'll explain the emergence of organizational behavior from a network perspective. An organization may have multiple departments and teams. For an organization to demonstrate a collective behavior, organizational members need to make decisions, which will then manifest through behaviors. In organizations, a decision comes before a behavior. In this sense, this is very similar to decision-making at an individual level. Our sensory systems, such as sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, take in information and send it to our brain. Then our brain processes the information transmitted from the sensory systems and make a decision, which is then carried out by our muscles. What we observe is behavior, which is an outward manifestation of decisions. If our brain decides what we hear is a threat signal, our body tries to stay away from it. If our brain decides what we see is a friendly signal, our body approaches it. How does an organization make decisions that serve the purpose of a common goal of the organization? In organizations, the information needed for decisions is usually generated or collected by different organizational members. And one organizational member's decision becomes the information for another organizational member's decision. You have information or resources relevant to other organizational members' decision and vice versa. As a result, organizational decisions require the exchange of information among organizational members. What's the infrastructure of information exchange in organizations? They are communication networks. In communication networks, organizational members are the nodes, and information that's needed for organizational decision-making flows through communication ties. This is very similar to the network as the infrastructure that transmits virus in epidemics. What are the differences between social networks in epidemics and organizational decision-making? The obvious difference is what flows through the network ties. In epidemics, virus is transmitted from one individual to another in social networks. In organizational decision-making, information is transmitted in social networks. You can consider an organization as a decision-making organ that has multiple networks of information processors. The function of those multiple networks is to process large volumes of incoming information efficiently. In this case, an organization functions like a human brain. Each individual in an organization is like a neuron that either relay or inhibit the transmission of a piece of information to the next neuron. Each department or team in an organization is like a brain region that has multiple functions that are dependent upon the need of other brain regions. Collectively, your brain takes in all information and then make a decision based on a winner-takes-all approach. A collective decision is usually made by the same winner-takes-all approach. A majority of a board's preference or a committee's preference is the winner, and that preference becomes the organization's decision. In this case, organizational decision-making can be boiled down to the transmission of information in the social networks in organizations. A healthy organization has a healthy information transmission network. In this network, information flows well from the information generators to recipients. There is no information congestion, there is no information suppression, but in many organizations, the information needed for Department A to make a decision gets stuck in Department B. The information collected in Department C is distorted or withheld as it travels upward in an organization. So people in Department D or the president's office doesn't have accurate, complete information to make a decision. Why do many organizations fall? To answer this question from a network perspective, we need to look at two things: network structure and network nodes, which are organizational members. First, let's look at network structure. When you look at an organization, you usually see an organizational chart. This is the designated official organizational communication. The organizational chart shows organizational hierarchy. It shows who reports to whom and how information flows in an organization. Ideally, information flows upwards and downwards without a problem. The people at the bottom of the organizational chart are like the sensory systems in your body. They are the ones who know what's really going on in an organization. Who have more accurate information about what works in an organization? People work in a customer service office or people in C-suite, such as Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Operation Officer, Chief Innovation Officer, Chief Diversity and Equity Officer, or Chief whatever officer. If you think those C-suite folks in corner offices have more accurate information of what works in their organizations, you live on an illusion island. There are many people who live on that illusion island. Recall the show Undercover Boss. If bosses have a better idea of what's going on in their organizations, there is no need for them to go undercover. I have known people who teach other people about leadership, but they themselves do everything they can to avoid people at the bottom. If you ask them why, the answer was those people at the bottom only knew how to complain. I was shocked at the answer. In my mind, I was asking, what else do you expect? You want everyone to bow to you and sing your praises? If you see people as the sensory systems of your organization, you want them to complain, to tell you what goes wrong in your organization and what does not work. Their input tells you what problems are so that you can fix them. If your body catches fire and your sensory systems don't tell you it's painful, you are in big trouble. The same applies to organizational communication networks as well. If you want to take a higher up position, you should expect that people will come to you to complain. Here is another question. Where should your office be located in the building where you are the top leader of an organization? Should your office occupy a corner on the top floor of the building? Does a corner office on the top floor help you receive accurate information that's needed for good decision making? Let's look at this illustration of how information flows in an organizational communication network. Consider node S as a source node who has a piece of information for a target node T to make a decision. In this network, the information has to travel from S to node 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then to node T. Here, the path length between node S and T is 7. It takes 7 steps for the information to travel from node S to reach node T. Any breakdown on this long path undermines the capability of node T to make a quality decision. Imagine you are node 4 in this network. How do you feel? Do you feel information overload? Because all information travels upwards to you. How to solve this problem? You can encourage your subordinates to build random ties that bypass the chain of command. We've learned from small world networks that adding random ties can shorten the path length of a pair of nodes. If node S gets to know node 7, then the path length is shortened from 7 steps to only 1 step. If node S knows T directly, that's even better. Their communication doesn't need any middleman or middlewoman. What are the implications of remote working on organizational communication networks? During the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us have worked remotely. What are the implications of this working mode on the communication networks? Does remote working make it easier to build random ties in organizations? The answer is negative. We lose randomness if we work online. We lose the opportunities to run into people in elevator, hallway, and office kitchen. It is the randomness that shortens the average path length in small world networks. Without randomness, a simple thing may need a long chain of people to complete. If you are node 4 in this network, how else do you feel? Do you feel powerful? You have access to all information that travels upwards to you, and you can decide whether to send information downwards to where the information is needed. You can also decide which part of the information to be withheld and which part of the information to be transmitted downwards in the network. If your goal is consistent with the organizational goal, then you have no reason to cut off the transmission from node S to node T. But what if your goal is to advance your career as fast as possible, or to show you are the most powerful person in the network? Do you have incentives to cut off the transmission from node S to node T, particularly when what's transmitted is the information that works against your personal goal? The answer is yes, absolutely, definitely. If you cut off the transmission from node S to node T to serve your self-interest, what would happen to the organization as a whole? The organizational goal is at the expense of an individual's personal goal. We've looked at the network structure. It's time to look at node attributes. What are the characteristics of the people at the top of an organizational chart? What kind of people are the favorites of an organizational promotion and leadership selection process? The people who are confident, not necessarily competent, who have the desire to hold a position at the top of an organizational chart. Mostly the people who have high implicit power motivation. Implicit power motivation is an unconscious motivation to influence others. People with high power motivation enjoy being persuasive and asserting social influence and dominance. An increase in the rank of organizational hierarchy produces a surge of dopamine in their brains, giving them a feeling of gratification. They enjoy the pleasure from having control over behaviors and circumstances of others. They enjoy the ability to allocate or withhold resources from others. Power is motivating for good and bad. To motivate people, Brexit campaign chose the slogan, "Let's take back control." The label of school choice implies that you have the power to choose which school your children can attend. If you want to motivate people, it is important to give people power. But it is very difficult for people with high implicit power motivation to share their power with others. It would drive them crazy, mad, and aggressive if they don't have control over others. They get angry at people who share their power, who block their expression of power, and who don't recognize their power. Have you heard some people say, "Do you even know who I am?" If people with high implicit power motivation don't have their way, they become aggressive. In epidemics, a virus doesn't care about whether you are a president or a janitor in an organization. What a virus cares about is its own survival by finding a new suitable host in which the virus can reproduce itself. But what do people with high power motivation care about? They care about gratifying their strong desire of asserting their influence and dominance. They care about having control over the behaviors and circumstances of others. To gratify their strong desire for power and control, they prefer to control the information flow in organizations. Encouraging their subordinates to bypass the chain of command runs against their strong desire for power and control. Another problem with power is that once we feel powerful, we tend to place more trust in ourselves, not others. What happens when the information that travels upwards is inconsistent with the power holder's expectation? Do power holders trust the people at the bottom of an organizational hierarchy or themselves? Very often, the power holders tend to dismiss others' advice and suggestions that are inconsistent with their preferences. Over time, those power holders are likely to be surrounded by yes men and yes women. The power holder's reality becomes distorted. Do you still remember the story of the emperor's new clothes? With distorted information, it is impossible to make good decisions that serve the organizational goals. There are more problems with high power motivation people occupying the top positions in an organization. We rarely have one person who has high power motivation in an organization. What's going to happen if there are multiple people with a high power motivation? They fight for dominance to gratify their own desire for power and control. They may sabotage others' work on purpose at the expense of the organizational goals. What are the consequences for the organization as a whole? An organization becomes some people's means to power. Gratifying one's desire for power is the primary goal, and the organization's goal becomes secondary. Who also have a strong desire to hold a position at the top of an organizational chart? Narcissists. They have very inflated self-views and focus on reinforcing their inflated self-views. They love spotlight. They have a strong desire for admiration. How do you know an organization has a narcissist administrator on the top of the organizational hierarchy? You look at the organizational website. Does the website put an individual's picture at a prominent place? You then look at the documents, memos, and press release from the organizations. Do you see an individual's picture at a prominent place? You can also watch the media interviews and the recordings of public meetings. Does that individual use the word I more than we? We can also find out the information of the salary and compensation. Much of the information is public. You can calculate the individual's compensation in relation to the second highest paid employee. Do you see a big gap between that individual's compensation and that of the second highest paid employee? If your answer is yes to all of the above questions, you've identified a narcissist at the top of an organizational hierarchy. You then look deeper. You begin to see the problems with the information transmission that is needed for collective wisdom as an organization. Many of the people at the top of an organizational chart are grandiose narcissists. They have a grandiose sense of self-importance and entitlement. They are arrogant and manipulative. They believe they are superior to others, so they deserve special treatment. You know the type. Grandiose narcissists aspire to become leaders in organizations. They also frequently achieve leadership roles in organizations. As narcissists, they are primarily motivated to pursue their own goals because that's the narcissist's nature, a grandiose sense of self-importance and entitlement, arrogance and manipulation, and a strong need for admiration. Grandiose narcissists can put organizational goals at risk. Individuals who are more narcissistic are more willing to lie, cheat, and steal than those who are less narcissistic. When someone says, "I want to be a leader," you need to be alarmed. There might be a narcissist standing in front of you. Very often, a good leader is a reluctant leader. George Washington didn't want to be the president of the United States. He wanted to go back to his home at Mount Vernon, living and dying a private citizen on his own farm. Washington agreed to become the president of the United States because he had concluded to obey the important and flattering call of my country. It is this kind of people who would truly put organizational goals before their own self-interest. If I hear people say, "I want to be a leader," I usually ask a follow-up question. Why do you want to be a leader? Sometimes they pause because they haven't thought about it. If it is your innate desire for self-importance, entitlement, and admiration, you don't think about it. You simply do it unconsciously. What's more, you should not trust what narcissists say because many of them are intelligent, eloquent, good at expressing themselves, and know what's the right thing to say at the right time. You observe what they do. You observe decisions they make. Do their decisions prioritize their own self-interest over the interest of their organizations? In addition to overconfidence, power motivation, and narcissism, who else are you likely to see at the top of an organizational chart? Psychopath. They typically lack empathy and remorse. They are fearless and confident. The trait of psychopathy is closely related to narcissism and Machiavellianism. Together, they are called the dark triad. In general, 1% of the people in general population are psychopaths. What environment attracts psychopaths? Organizations. Psychopaths thrive in organizations. Among the upper echelons of organizations, the percentage of psychopaths reaches up to 3.5%. The higher the organizational hierarchy, the higher the percentage of psychopaths. Who are most likely to be psychopaths in organizations? Presidents, CEOs, and executives. The top one occupation of a psychopath is CEO or executive. Psychopaths are fearless and confident, so they are more likely to be offered a job in the first place. Once they get the job, they exploit and bully colleagues into obedience. They spread rumors to undermine competitors. They pit colleagues against one another. Even though psychopaths are toxic in organizations, but they cozy up to their bosses. So from their boss's perspective, psychopaths can do the job and may even have the above average job performance. So their resume looks great. Psychopaths know they cannot stay at one place for too long, because the way they do their jobs is not sustainable. People who work with psychopaths tend to leave or have the intention to leave. In less than 5 years, psychopaths use their polished resume to land a more powerful job. The entire cycle begins in the new organization. This is another reason that many organizations become dysfunctional. Now you see why many organizations become dysfunctional and fall eventually. It is a combination of network structure in an organizational hierarchy and the characteristics of those at the top of an organizational hierarchy. For an organization to make right collective decisions that advance the organizational goals, it requires robust information transmission. But the traits of those who occupy the top positions in an organizational hierarchy go against robust information transmission. Node attributes influence network structure. In information cascade, an important node attribute is threshold. Here in organizational communication networks, the important node attributes are the traits of overconfidence, power motivation, narcissism, and psychopathy. How to build a robust, resilient organizational communication network that is responsive to internal and external threats to an organizational goal. Here are 2 options. Option 1, in organization A, administrators in the upper echelons design tools and databases for organizational members to use and contribute to. The assumption of this approach is that if an organizational member needs a piece of information to complete his or her work, that organizational member can use those centrally designed tools and databases. In organization B, To respond to ambiguity in decision making, organizational members are encouraged to search necessary information through their social networks, mostly the informal communication networks that are not visible in an organizational chart. Which option is more effective to build a communication network that is responsive to internal and external threats? You may say both. Of course, you can do both if you live in an ideal world. Remember that building a toolkit or database has a cost. Building any social tie has a cost in terms of time and energy. If you live in reality, you are forced to consider the cost of each approach. Now, let's take another look at the two options. Which option has lower costs? Option B. Since the information flows through an informal social network, if you're an administrator, you don't even need to worry about creating an item in your organizational budget. Of course, there is a cost of time, and time can be considered as priceless. Here is another question. Which option creates a more flexible communication network? Option B. Why? People in organization B have the autonomy to decide where to go to find the information. In organization A, if one route turns out to be a dead end, you have nowhere to go. But in organization B, if one route turns out to be a dead end, you can try another route. If you want to report an error in your organization, for example, your boss's unethical behavior of using organizational resources to serve personal interest, you go to the Department of Human Resources. But you hit a dead end. The HR department takes your information but fails to respond. You later find out that the director of HR department is a personal friend of your boss. What do? If you have a strong will to correct that error, stop your boss' unethical behavior, and deter future unethical behavior, you can take other routes. You can use your informal social networks within the organization. For example, you can informally talk to the secretary to the president, the director of Department X, or other employees. All those people have their own informal social networks within the organization. So your information spreads in the organizational communication network, and that piece of information takes a life of its own in the network. It has a potential of creating an information cascade, which we've discussed in the previous video. In organization B, since the information about your boss' unethical behavior has a life of its own in the organizational communication network, it is very difficult to hide or constrain the spread of information. At some point, other organizational members cannot justify not addressing the information anymore. They have to respond in a way to correct the error in the organization. Why? Because the error is so visible and obvious that it is not in other organizational members' self-interest to dismiss it. Otherwise, they become part of the cover-up and they become part of the error. It is in their self-interest and organizational interest to correct the error. As a result, the error in organization B is more likely to be exposed and corrected than that in organization A. After correcting the error, organization B goes back to its equilibrium state until a new error emerges, and the communication network responds accordingly. If the error correcting process works well for organizations, then why are so many organizations dysfunctional? There are many reasons. One reason is that the power holders have an incentive of not to expose the errors if they benefit from those errors. Another reason is that bypassing the chain of command is not rewarded in many organizations, but punished. When you join an organization, you usually have an orientation or a training. It is more likely that you are encouraged to respect instead of break the chain of command. Not many people on the chain of command want their power and control to be challenged. In this video, I covered two topics: why many organizations fall and the equilibrium state of organizational communication network. Next week, we'll learn a network metric of centrality.